The battery cables were ripped out. The medical bag had been torn apart and thrown across the floor. Someone had sabotaged my ambulance, and across the street, an 8-year-old girl was dying from an asthma attack. I had maybe 3 minutes to save her life, and the one person who had threatened to destroy my ambulance was standing in the shadows, watching everything unfold. This is the story of how a power-hungry HOA president nearly killed a child just to prove a point, and how the entire neighborhood finally saw her for the monster she truly was. If you have ever dealt with someone who believed their authority was more important than human life, you already know how dangerous these people can be. But what Karen Duval did that stormy night crossed every line imaginable. She thought she was untouchable. She thought her clipboard and her fake smile gave her power over everyone. She was wrong. And by the end of this story, you will see exactly how wrong she was. My name is Daniel Ortiz, and I have been a paramedic for 15 years. I have seen things that would give most people nightmares. I have held dying patients in my arms. I have delivered babies in the back of ambulances during traffic jams. I have performed CPR on children while their parents screamed in the background. Nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what that woman put me through. It started in the spring of 2022 when my wife Maria and I decided to move our family to Willow Creek Estates. We had 2 kids, Sophia, who was 12, and little Marcus, who was 7. We wanted a nice neighborhood with good schools and friendly neighbors. The houses were beautiful, the lawns were pristine, and everyone seemed welcoming during our first visit. What we did not know was that this neighborhood was being ruled by a tyrant. Before we continue, I need you to do something for me. If you believe that people like Karen need to be stopped, if you believe that bullies and tyrants should face consequences for their actions, then hit that subscribe button right now. We post daily stories about entitled people getting exactly what they deserve, and trust me, Karen's punishment is one of the most satisfying things you will ever hear. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join our community of people who refuse to let bullies win. Now let me tell you about Karen Duval. She was in her early 50s, always dressed like she was attending a country club brunch, even when she was just checking the mail. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her makeup always flawless, and she always wore those ridiculous, long, fake red acrylic nails. She clicked them on every surface like she was reminding the world she existed. She had been the HOA president for 7 years, and in that time, she had turned the neighborhood into her personal kingdom. The first time I met Karen was the day we moved in. The moving truck was still being unloaded when I saw this woman marching across my lawn with a clipboard pressed against her chest. She had this smile on her face, but her eyes were cold, dead cold, like a shark sizing up its prey. She said, "Welcome to Willow Creek Estates. I am Karen Duval, president of the Homeowners Association. We have very high standards here, and I just want to make sure you understand how things work." I tried to be polite. I shook her hand and thanked her for the welcome, but she was not there to welcome us. She was there to establish dominance. She looked at the moving truck and said, "Just so you know, moving vehicles cannot be parked on the street past 6 p.m. Also, I noticed your lawn has some weeds growing near the sidewalk. You will need to address that within 72 hours or face a fine." We had literally owned the house for less than 24 hours. The weeds had been there when we bought it. But Karen did not care about logic or fairness. She cared about control. My wife tried to smooth things over. She smiled and said, "We will take care of everything. Thank you so much for stopping by." Karen barely acknowledged Maria. Her eyes were locked on the back of the moving truck where the movers were unloading our furniture. I could see her mentally cataloguing every item, probably looking for something else to complain about. Then she saw it. Through the open garage door, she spotted my work vehicle. My marked ambulance was parked inside, still connected to the charger I had installed specifically for it. As a senior paramedic with the county emergency services, I was part of the rapid response program. That meant I kept my ambulance at home so I could respond to calls faster. In emergencies, every second counts. Having my ambulance at home instead of at the station could mean the difference between life and death. Karen's face changed. That fake smile disappeared, and something darker took its place. She pointed at the ambulance and said, "What is that?" I explained that it was my work vehicle. I told her I was a paramedic and that I was part of a response program that required me to keep the ambulance at my residence. She shook her head slowly and said, "No, no, that is not going to work. We do not allow commercial vehicles in this neighborhood." I tried to explain that it was not a commercial vehicle. It was an emergency response vehicle. There was a difference. But Karen was not interested in differences or explanations or anything that challenged her worldview. She said, "I do not care what you call it. It is big, it is ugly, and it does not belong here. You need to find somewhere else to park that thing." I stayed calm. I told her that I had already checked with the county and with state regulations. Emergency responders were legally allowed to keep their vehicles at their homes. It was protected by law. Karen laughed. It was this cold, dismissive laugh that made my skin crawl. She said, "Sweetie, I do not care what the state says. In this neighborhood, the HOA rules are what matter, and my rules say no commercial vehicles. You have 1 week to find alternative parking." Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking on my driveway like a countdown to disaster. Maria looked at me with concern in her eyes. She asked if Karen could really make us move the ambulance. I told her no, the law was clear, but I also knew that people like Karen did not care about laws, they cared about power, and I had just challenged her power in front of her kingdom. The first official violation notice came exactly 7 days later. It was stuck to my front door in a bright yellow envelope with the HOA logo stamped on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper informing me that I was in violation of Section 4.7 of the Community Guidelines regarding unauthorized commercial vehicles on residential property. The fine was $100. I called the HOA office to dispute it. A woman named Brenda answered. She sounded tired, like she had fielded 1,000 calls just like mine. I explained the situation. I told her I was a paramedic. I told her the ambulance was required to be at my home. I told her about the state regulations protecting emergency responders. Brenda sighed and said, "Sir, I understand. But Karen has already flagged your property. Once she flags a property, there is nothing I can do. You will have to bring it up at the next board meeting." I asked when the next board meeting was. She said it was in 6 weeks. 6 weeks of fines. At $100 per violation, Karen could bleed me dry before I ever got a chance to defend myself. I asked Brenda how many violations Karen typically issued. There was a long pause. Then she said, for someone on her radar, daily, sometimes multiple times a day. I felt my stomach drop. This was not going to be a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a polite conversation. This was war. The fines started piling up. Every single day, there was a new yellow envelope on my door. Sometimes there were two, sometimes three. Karen was creative with her violations. One day it was for the ambulance being visible from the street. The next day it was for the ambulance blocking the sidewalk, even though it was entirely on my driveway. The day after that, it was for visual clutter because the ambulance had reflective markings that apparently offended Karen's delicate sensibilities. I kept every single envelope. I documented every single violation. I took photographs with timestamps. I was building a case, even though I did not know yet what I would need it for. About 2 weeks into this nightmare, I came home after a particularly brutal shift. We had responded to a car accident involving a family of 4. The father did not make it. I had to watch his wife's face as I told her that her husband was gone. Those moments never leave you. They become part of you, these heavy stones that you carry around forever. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained. All I wanted was to hug my kids and sit on my couch and try to remember what normal felt like. I parked the ambulance in my driveway and walked toward my front door. I did not even make it to the porch before I heard her voice. "Daniel, oh, Daniel." Karen was marching across the street from wherever she had been lurking. She had her clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other. She was taking pictures of my ambulance like she was documenting a crime scene. I stopped and waited for her. I did not have the energy to run or hide. She walked up to me with that predatory smile and said, "Another violation, Daniel. That is 3 today. You really should consider parking that eyesore somewhere else." I looked at her, really looked at her. I tried to understand what kind of person could be so focused on a parked ambulance when there was actual suffering in the world, when people were dying and families were being destroyed and children were losing their parents. I said, "Karen, I just spent 14 hours trying to save lives. A man died in my arms tonight. His children will grow up without a father. Can you please, for one night, just leave me alone?" For a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe shame, maybe just a momentary glitch in her programming. Then it was gone. She said, "That sounds like a personal problem, Daniel. My job is to maintain property values in this neighborhood. Your ugly ambulance is making everyone's homes worth less. If you cannot follow the rules, maybe you should not have moved here." She shoved another yellow envelope into my hand and walked away. I stood there in my driveway, holding that envelope, feeling something shift inside me. Before that moment, I had been annoyed, frustrated, inconvenienced, but now I was angry, truly, deeply angry, not just for myself, but for everyone Karen had ever bullied, for everyone who had been made to feel small by her petty tyranny. Maria met me at the door. She could see it on my face. She asked what happened. I told her Karen happened. Again. Maria took my hand and led me inside. She sat me down at the kitchen table and put a cup of coffee in front of me even though it was almost midnight. She said, "Danny, this cannot continue. She is harassing you. This is not about the ambulance anymore. This is personal." I knew she was right, but I also knew that fighting someone like Karen was not simple. She had the HOA behind her. She had rules and regulations and bureaucracy on her side. And most importantly, she had time. She could dedicate her entire existence to making my life miserable because apparently she had nothing better to do. I told Maria that we needed to be smart about this. We needed to document everything. We needed to build an airtight case. And then we needed to take it to the board and expose Karen for what she really was. Maria nodded and said, "Okay. But Danny, you need to promise me something. You cannot let her win, not just for us, but for everyone in this neighborhood she has terrorized." I promised her. I did not know then how hard that promise would be to keep. Over the next several weeks, I talked to our neighbors. What I discovered was horrifying. Karen had been running this neighborhood like a dictator for years. She had fined the elderly couple on the corner because their holiday decorations stayed up 2 days past the approved window. She had issued violations to a single mother because her children's toys were visible in the backyard. She had personally measured the grass height on every lawn in the neighborhood and fined anyone whose grass was even a quarter-inch above the limit. But the worst story came from our neighbor Greg. He was a quiet guy in his 60s, retired from the postal service. He and his wife had lived in Willow Creek for almost 20 years. Greg told me about his brother, who had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 3 years ago. His brother had come to stay with them for hospice care, and they had rented a hospital bed and medical equipment to make him comfortable during his final months. Karen had issued them violations for having medical equipment visible through the windows. She had demanded they close their blinds at all times or face fines. When Greg's brother passed away, Karen had the audacity to show up at their door the very next day to inspect the property and make sure all the medical equipment had been removed. Greg's wife cried for weeks after that, not just because of losing her brother-in-law, but because of how Karen had treated them during the worst time of their lives. I asked Greg why no one had ever stood up to her. He sighed and said, "We tried, Danny. A few years back, a group of us got together and tried to vote her out. She found out about it before the meeting. The next day, every single person involved got hit with multiple violations. She fined people into submission. Some of them moved away just to escape her. The rest of us learned to keep our heads down. I asked him what made her like this. What turned a person into such a monster? Greg shrugged and said, power. Some people get a little bit of power, and it ruins them. Karen runs this HOA like it is her own personal kingdom, and in her mind, anyone who challenges her is a threat to her throne. I thanked Greg for talking to me. As I walked back to my house, I realized something important. This was not just about me and my ambulance. This was about an entire neighborhood living in fear of one woman. If someone did not stand up to her, she would keep terrorizing people for years to come. That someone was going to have to be me. The harassment continued. Every day brought new violations, new fines, new confrontations. Karen seemed to have an endless supply of creative ways to make my life miserable. One morning, she showed up at 7 a.m. while I was loading my kids into the car for school. She stood at the edge of my driveway and photographed the ambulance from multiple angles while my children watched. Sophia asked me, Daddy, why does that lady keep taking pictures of our car? I told her not to worry about it. I said some people just had too much time on their hands. Karen heard me. She lowered her phone and glared at me. She said, I heard that, Daniel, and let me tell you something. I have all the time in the world to make your life difficult. This will not end until that ambulance is gone. Marcus, my 7-year-old, looked up at me with wide eyes and asked, is she going to take Daddy's ambulance away? I knelt down and hugged him. I told him no one was taking anything. I said Daddy's ambulance helped people, and we were going to keep helping people no matter what. Karen scoffed and walked away, her heels stabbing into my driveway like tiny acts of violence. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat in my garage staring at the ambulance. This vehicle had been with me through hundreds of calls. It had carried me to burning buildings and car wrecks and medical emergencies of every kind. It had been present for some of the best moments of my career, when I saved lives that everyone said were impossible to save. It had also been there for the worst moments, when I lost patience despite doing everything right. This ambulance was more than a vehicle. It was my partner, and Karen wanted to take it away because it offended her aesthetic sensibilities. I made a decision that night. I was not going to back down. I was going to fight Karen with everything I had, and I was going to win. The board meeting finally arrived. 6 weeks of fines, 6 weeks of harassment, 6 weeks of mental torture. I had accumulated over $4,000 in violations. I had a folder thick with documentation. I had witness statements from neighbors. I had copies of state regulations clearly protecting my right to park my emergency vehicle at my home. I walked into that meeting room prepared for battle. The board consisted of 5 people. Karen, of course, was at the head of the table. There was Harold, a nervous man in his 70s who seemed terrified of Karen. There was Patricia, a woman about Karen's age who nodded along to everything Karen said. There was Robert, a younger guy who spent most of the meeting looking at his phone. And there was Susan, the only one who made eye contact with me when I walked in. Karen called the meeting to order. She went through the usual business first: budget updates, maintenance schedules, upcoming community events. She dragged it out for over an hour, and I knew she was doing it on purpose to wear me down. Finally, she got to what she called violation disputes. She looked at me and said, "We have a dispute from Daniel Ortiz regarding parking violations. Mr. Ortiz, you have 5 minutes." 5 minutes. After 6 weeks of harassment, she was giving me 5 minutes. I stood up and approached the front of the room. I kept my voice calm and professional. I started by introducing myself as a 15-year paramedic with county emergency services. I explained the rapid response program and why I was required to keep my ambulance at my residence. I cited the state regulations by name and number. I showed them the documentation from my employer confirming my participation in the program. Then I addressed the violations directly. I explained that the HOA covenant, which I had read cover to cover, did not actually prohibit emergency vehicles. It prohibited commercial vehicles used for business purposes. My ambulance was not commercial. It was a county-owned emergency response vehicle. There was a legal distinction. I showed them the fines I had accumulated, over $4,000 for simply doing my job, for keeping my neighborhood safe. Karen interrupted me. She said my 5 minutes were up. I looked at the clock. It had been 3.5 minutes. I told her I was not finished. She said the rules are clear. 5 minutes per dispute. Sit down, Mr. Ortiz. Susan spoke up. She said Karen should let me finish. She said this seemed like an important matter that deserved full consideration. Karen shot Susan a look that could have melted steel. Patricia chimed in and said Karen was right. Rules were rules. Harold stared at the table and said nothing. Robert did not even look up from his phone. Karen smiled that predatory smile and said, "Motion to uphold all violations against Daniel Ortiz. All in favor." Patricia's hand went up immediately. Harold slowly raised his after a sharp look from Karen. Robert raised his without even knowing what he was voting for. Karen said, "Motion carries. Mr. Ortiz, your violations stand. You have 30 days to pay the accumulated fines or face additional penalties." I stood there in disbelief. I had presented evidence. I had cited laws. I had made a clear, logical argument, and they had dismissed it in less than 5 seconds. Karen leaned forward and said, "Perhaps now you understand, Daniel. In this neighborhood, my rules are the only rules that matter." I left that meeting humiliated and furious, but I was not defeated. If the HOA would not listen to reason, I would find someone who would. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. Her name was Angela Chen, and she specialized in HOA disputes. When I explained my situation, she actually laughed. Not at me, at Karen. She said, "Mr. Ortiz, this is one of the clearest cases of HOA overreach I have ever seen. State law explicitly protects emergency responders. This Karen woman does not have a leg to stand on." I asked her what we could do. She told me we could send a cease and desist letter immediately. If the HOA continued to issue violations, we could sue them for harassment and civil rights violations. She said in cases like this, courts often awarded damages plus legal fees. I told her to do it, send the letter, put Karen on notice. Angela drafted the letter that same day. It was beautiful. 4 pages of legal jargon that essentially said if Karen issued one more violation against me, we would sue the HOA into oblivion. I hand-delivered it to the HOA office myself. I watched Brenda's face go pale as she read it. She looked up at me and said, "Mr. Ortiz, I am so sorry. I tried to warn you about Karen." I told her it was not her fault. I asked her to make sure Karen received the letter personally. Brenda nodded and said, "Oh, she will receive it. But Mr. Ortiz, be careful. Karen does not like being challenged. When she feels threatened, she gets dangerous." I thanked Brenda and left. I thought the letter would be the end of it. I thought Karen would back down once she realized she was facing actual legal consequences. I was wrong. The letter did not stop Karen. It made her worse. She stopped issuing official violations. Instead, she started a campaign of harassment that was harder to document. She would walk past my house multiple times a day, loudly talking on her phone about that awful paramedic and that I saw in the driveway. She would stand at the edge of my property and stare at my house for minutes at a time. She started approaching my children. One afternoon, Sophia came home from the bus stop looking upset. I asked her what was wrong. She said the lady with the red nails had talked to her. My blood ran cold. I asked what Karen had said. Sophia told me that Karen had asked her if her daddy was going to get rid of the ugly ambulance. She said Karen had told her that their family was ruining the neighborhood. I felt rage like I had never felt before. This woman had crossed a line that should never be crossed. She had involved my child in her sick power games. I called Angela immediately and told her what happened. Angela was furious. She said this was clear harassment of a minor. She said we could escalate the lawsuit significantly. But more than that, Angela told me to file a police report. She said Karen's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and potentially dangerous. We needed official documentation in case things escalated further. I went to the police station that same day. I spoke with a detective named Williams. He was a calm, methodical man who listened carefully as I explained everything. He took notes and said, "Mr. Ortiz, this definitely sounds like harassment. We can issue a warning to Ms. Duval, but unless she makes a direct threat or commits an overt act, there is not much we can do legally." I understood. I asked him to issue the warning anyway. Maybe it would scare Karen into backing off. Detective Williams nodded and said he would handle it personally. The warning did not work. In fact, it seemed to push Karen closer to the edge. 2 days after the police visit, I came home to find my trash cans dumped over in my driveway. The garbage was scattered everywhere, and my ambulance had been covered in raw eggs. I checked my security cameras. The footage showed a figure in dark clothing approaching my house at 3 in the morning. The figure was careful to keep their face hidden, but I caught a glimpse of something important. Long, red fingernails. I called Detective Williams again. He came to my house and reviewed the footage. He said, "I cannot definitively identify the person, but those nails are distinctive. Combined with the history of harassment, I would say Karen Duval is our prime suspect." He told me to be vigilant. He said people like Karen often escalated when they felt cornered. He said if anything else happened, I should call immediately. That night, I installed additional security cameras. I made sure every angle of my property was covered. I installed motion sensor lights. I even put a lock on my ambulance hood, thinking I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. I was not paranoid enough. The storm came 3 weeks later. It was one of those brutal summer storms that turn day into night and make you wonder if the world is ending. The wind was howling. The rain was coming down in sheets. Lightning cracked across the sky every few seconds. The power went out across the entire neighborhood around 9 p.m. My family and I gathered in the living room with flashlights and candles. The kids thought it was an adventure. Maria and I exchanged worried looks but tried to keep things calm. Around 10:30, my emergency pager went off. I looked at the screen. The address was on my street, just 4 houses down. Pediatric respiratory emergency. 8-year-old female. I knew that house. That was the Martinez family. Their daughter was Olivia, a sweet girl who played with my daughter sometimes. I knew Olivia had severe asthma. I had even given her mother Alina tips on managing attacks. I grabbed my keys and ran for the garage. Maria called after me, asking if I needed help. I told her to stay with the kids. I said I would be right back. I sprinted through the garage and jumped into my ambulance. I turned the key. Nothing. No engine turnover. No lights on the dashboard. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and popped the hood. What I saw made my heart stop. The battery cables had been completely disconnected. Not just disconnected, they had been cut. Someone had taken wire cutters to my ambulance cables. I felt sick, but I did not have time to process it. Olivia was dying 4 houses away. I ran to the back of the ambulance to grab my emergency bag, the one I always kept stocked for situations exactly like this. The side hatch was already open. Inside, the bag had been unzipped. Medical supplies were scattered everywhere. Medication vials were smashed on the floor. My portable oxygen tank was missing. Someone had sabotaged my ambulance. Someone had gone through my equipment and destroyed what they could not take. And I knew exactly who that someone was. I could hear screaming from down the street. Elena Martinez was screaming for help. Her daughter was dying, and I was standing in my garage with a destroyed ambulance. I grabbed what I could: a handful of unopened medication packages, a pediatric mask that had been knocked under the seat, a manual resuscitator that the saboteur had apparently missed. Then I ran. I sprinted through the storm, rain pelting my face, lightning illuminating the street in strobe flashes. I could see Alina on her porch, holding Olivia in her arms, screaming into the darkness. I reached them in less than a minute. Olivia was bad. Her lips were blue. Her chest was heaving, but no air was getting through. She was in full respiratory distress. I took her from Alina and laid her on the porch floor. I told Alina to call 911 again and tell them we needed immediate transport. Alina was hysterical. She was crying and screaming and asking if her daughter was going to die. I told her I needed her to focus. I said Olivia was going to be okay, but I needed her help. I administered albuterol from the salvaged medication. I used the manual resuscitator to help force air into her lungs. I talked to Olivia constantly, telling her to breathe, telling her she was doing great, telling her everything was going to be fine. The minutes stretched into hours. At least that is what it felt like. In reality, it was probably 10 minutes before I heard the backup ambulance sirens. But in those 10 minutes, I fought for Olivia's life with nothing but broken equipment and sheer willpower. When the backup crew arrived, Olivia was breathing on her own. Her color was coming back. She was going to make it. I stepped back and let the other paramedics take over. They loaded Olivia into the ambulance while Alina climbed in after her. Before they closed the doors, Alina grabbed my hand. She was crying, but this time with relief. She said, "Daniel, you saved her. You saved my baby." I told her to go. I said she should be with her daughter. I said I would check on them at the hospital later. The ambulance pulled away, lights flashing, sirens wailing. I stood in the rain, watching it go, feeling the adrenaline start to fade. And that is when I saw her. Karen was standing at the edge of her property, just barely visible in the darkness. She was holding an umbrella, even though she was mostly sheltered by a tree. She was watching. Not helping, not calling for assistance, just watching. When a lightning flash illuminated the street, our eyes met. Karen's face was blank, no shock, no relief that a child had been saved, nothing. Then she realized I could see her, and she hurried away into the darkness. One of my neighbors, an older man named Richard, who had come outside during the commotion, walked up to me. He said, "Was that Karen?" I said yes. He said, "Why was she just standing there?" I did not answer, but I knew why. She had been watching to see if her sabotage would succeed. She wanted to see me fail. She wanted to see that ambulance sit useless while a child suffered. I walked back to my house in a daze. Maria met me at the door, already in tears, because one of the other neighbors had told her what happened. She asked if Olivia was okay. I told her she was going to be fine. Then I showed her my ambulance. I showed her the cut cables. I showed her the destroyed equipment. Maria's face went white. She asked who could have done this. I said I knew exactly who did it, and I was going to prove it. The next morning, I filed a police report, not just for property damage, not just for vandalism. I told Detective Williams that someone had tampered with my emergency vehicle in a way that could have cost a child her life. I told him this was attempted murder by negligence. Williams was serious this time. He came to my house personally. He brought a crime scene technician. They dusted for fingerprints. They photographed everything. They collected evidence. The technician found something near the driver's side door, small shards of broken acrylic, bright red acrylic. Williams held up the fragments and said, "These look like artificial fingernails." I said I knew whose nails they were. Williams asked me to let them handle it from here. He said if I confronted Karen directly, It could jeopardize the investigation. I agreed to stay away from her, but I was already planning my next move. While the police investigated the sabotage, I rallied the neighbors. Every person who had ever been victimized by Karen, every family she had fined into poverty, every household she had terrorized with her clipboard and her rules. We organized a petition to remove Karen from the HOA presidency. Within 48 hours, we had signatures from over 80% of the households in Willow Creek estates. But we also did something else. We started sharing our stories with each other, and what emerged was a pattern of abuse that went back years. Karen had harassed the elderly. She had targeted single parents. She had gone after anyone she perceived as weak or vulnerable. She had used her position to punish anyone who dared to challenge her authority. And now she had sabotaged an emergency vehicle and nearly killed a child. The community was finally ready to fight back. The emergency HOA meeting happened 5 days after the storm. The community center was packed. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. I had never seen so many Willow Creek residents in one place. Karen walked in like she owned the room. She was dressed in her usual country club attire, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, those red acrylic nails clicking against her clipboard. She looked around the room and said, "What is all this? I did not authorize this many attendees." I stood up and said, "She did not get to authorize anything anymore." Karen's eyes narrowed. She said, "Daniel, I should have known you would be behind this circus." I told her this was not a circus. I said it was a reckoning. Then I presented everything. I presented the petition with the signatures. I presented the documentation of her harassment against me and other residents. I presented the police report about the sabotaged ambulance. I presented the evidence collected from the scene, including the red acrylic fragments. I presented witness statements. Richard confirmed seeing Karen watching from the shadows during Olivia's emergency. Another neighbor confirmed seeing Karen near my driveway earlier that evening, claiming she was checking for code violations. 3 other residents confirmed seeing Karen behaving strangely in the days before the storm. Karen's face went from confident to worried to outright panicked. She said, "This is ridiculous. I did not sabotage anything. I was in my home all night during the storm." Susan, the board member who had tried to help me at the previous meeting, spoke up. She said Karen's claim was interesting because she had seen Karen leaving her house at approximately 8 p.m., about an hour before the power went out. Karen sputtered and said Susan was lying. Harold, the nervous board member who had always sided with Karen, suddenly found his voice. He said he had also seen Karen that night. He said she had been walking toward my street with what looked like a bag of tools. The room erupted. People started shouting. Neighbors who had been silent for years were finally speaking up. Karen screamed over the noise. She said, "You cannot do this to me. I have given everything to this neighborhood. I have maintained standards. I have protected property values. You should be thanking me." I walked toward her. I stopped just a few feet away and looked her directly in the eyes. I said, "Karen, you almost killed an 8-year-old girl. And for what? Because you did not like the way my ambulance looked." Karen's composure cracked. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. She said, "I was just trying to maintain the community standards." I said she was trying to maintain control. I said she was so obsessed with power that she was willing to let a child die rather than admit she was wrong. The vote was called. It was not even close. The motion to remove Karen from the HOA presidency passed with 93% in favor. Karen stood there as the results were announced. Her face was a mask of shock and disbelief. She could not comprehend that her reign was over, that her power had finally been stripped away. She started to say something, but the sound of the community center doors opening cut her off. Detective Williams walked in, followed by 2 uniformed officers. He approached Karen and said, "Karen Duval, You are under arrest for tampering with an emergency vehicle, harassment, reckless endangerment, and falsifying official documents." Karen's eyes went wide. She said they could not arrest her. She said she was the HOA president. Williams said, "Ma'am, you were the HOA president. Now you are under arrest." The officers moved in and handcuffed Karen right there in front of everyone. As they led her toward the door, she started screaming. She screamed, "This is all his fault. If he had not parked that thing here, none of this would have happened. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. I was just doing my job." Nobody responded to her. Nobody defended her. Nobody even looked at her with sympathy. As she was dragged past me, I met her eyes one more time. I said, "Goodbye, Karen." Her scream of rage echoed through the room long after the doors closed behind her. The legal process took several months. Karen was charged with multiple felonies and misdemeanors. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The crime scene analysis had found her fingerprints on my ambulance hood. The red acrylic fragments matched the exact color and brand of nails she always wore. Her own phone records showed she had been searching for information about ambulance engines and battery systems in the days before the storm. And perhaps most damning, the police found the missing oxygen tank in her garage, hidden behind some boxes. She had apparently kept it as a trophy. Karen hired an expensive lawyer and tried to claim she was innocent. She said the evidence was planted. She said I had framed her because I was angry about the parking violations. She even tried to claim that someone else had worn fake red nails to make her look guilty. The jury did not believe any of it. Karen was convicted on all charges. The judge called her actions reprehensible and said she had shown a callous disregard for human life. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison. As she was led away after the sentencing, she still maintained her innocence. She was still screaming about property values and community standards. She was still claiming she had done nothing wrong. Some people never learn. Some people are so consumed by their own sense of importance that they cannot see the damage they cause. Karen was one of those people. But at least now, she would not be able to hurt anyone else for a long, long time. The aftermath in Willow Creek Estates was remarkable. The new HOA board, led by Susan as president, immediately passed new regulations protecting first responders. Any household with a first responder was explicitly permitted to keep their emergency vehicle on their property without any restrictions. They also conducted a full audit of Karen's violations over the past 7 years. They discovered that she had issued over 4,000 improper violations during her reign. More than $300,000 in fines had been collected under false pretenses. The board voted to refund every single fine. For many residents, this meant getting back money that had caused them genuine financial hardship. The elderly couple on the corner received $1,200 back. The single mother with the toys in the backyard got $800. Greg and his wife received compensation for the mental anguish Karen had caused during his brother's final days. The refund checks were mailed with a letter of apology from the new board. It was not much, but it was a start. Olivia Martinez made a full recovery. Her parents came to my house about a week after the trial ended, bringing homemade cookies and a card that Olivia had drawn herself. The card showed a picture of an ambulance with a heart on it. Underneath, in crayon letters, it said, "Thank you for saving me." Elena hugged me and cried. She said she would never be able to repay me for what I had done. I told her she did not owe me anything. I told her this was my job. This was why I became a paramedic in the first place. But Elena shook her head. She said it was more than a job. She said most people would have given up when they saw the sabotaged ambulance. Most people would have waited for backup. But I grabbed what I could and run through the storm to save her daughter. She said that was not just doing a job. That was being a hero. I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a guy who had been put in an impossible situation and done the best he could. But I accepted the cookies and the card. I hung the card on my refrigerator where I could see it every day. It reminded me why this fight had been worth it. The neighborhood changed after Karen's removal. Not overnight, but gradually. People started talking to each other again. They held block parties and neighborhood barbecues. They helped each other with yard work and watched each other's kids. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Karen had cultivated for years slowly dissolved. One evening, about 3 months after Karen's conviction, I was sitting on my front porch watching the sunset. My ambulance was parked in the driveway, freshly washed and fully restocked with new equipment. Greg walked by with his wife. He stopped and waved. He said, "Beautiful evening, Danny." I said it really was. He looked at the ambulance and smiled. He said, I used to hate looking at that thing. Karen had convinced me it was an eyesore, but now when I see it, I feel safe. I feel like our neighborhood finally has someone looking out for us. I told him I would always look out for this neighborhood. I said it was my home now. Greg nodded and continued on his walk. I watched him go, feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Peace. Maria came out and sat next to me. She took my hand and leaned her head on my shoulder. She asked what I was thinking about. I told her I was thinking about how strange life was. I said we had moved here looking for a safe neighborhood, and instead we had found a tyrant. But in fighting that tyrant, we had actually created the safe neighborhood we wanted. Maria laughed and said, I never would have chosen to go through all of that, but I am glad we did. I am proud of you for standing up when everyone else was afraid. I told her I could not have done it without her. I said she had been my rock through everything. She squeezed my hand and said, that is what partners do. We hold each other up when things get hard. We sat there together as the sun went down, watching the neighborhood we had fought so hard to save. Now I want to talk to you directly. I know a lot of you watching this have dealt with your own Karens. Maybe not someone who sabotaged an ambulance, but someone who used their little bit of power to make your life miserable. HOA tyrants, workplace bullies, neighbors from hell, family members who think they can control everyone around them. These people exist everywhere, and they count on one thing to maintain their power: silence. They count on their victims being too tired to fight back, too scared to speak up, too isolated to realize they are not alone. The most important thing I learned from my battle with Karen is this: you are not alone. There are always other people who have been victimized by the same bully. There are always allies waiting to be found. And when you finally stand up, when you finally say enough is enough, you will discover strength you never knew you had. Do not let the Karens of the world win. Do not let them silence you. Do not let them make you feel small. Fight back, document everything, build your case, find your allies, and when the time is right, expose them for what they really are. You might be surprised at how quickly their house of cards comes tumbling down. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel less alone in your own battles, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me about your own Karen experience. Tell me how you fought back. Tell me how you won. And if you have not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We post daily content about entitled people getting exactly what they deserve, and every story is as satisfying as this one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe they are dealing with their own Karen right now. Maybe they need to know that standing up is possible. Together, we can create a world where bullies and tyrants no longer have power. A world where people like Karen face consequences for their actions. A world where the good guys finally win. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, no matter how powerful they seem, tyrants always fall in the end. Stay strong, stay safe, and keep fighting the good fight. This is Daniel Ortiz, signing off from Willow Creek Estates, where the sun is shining, the neighbors are friendly, and a certain HOA tyrant is finally behind bars where she belongs.